The concept of evil is one that humanity has grappled with for millennia. We often imagine it as a solitary force, a corrupting influence contained within a single, monstrous individual. But history has shown us a more terrifying truth, that evil can be a collaborative effort. When two damaged souls find one another, their darkness doesn't just double, it multiplies, creating a feedback loop of depravity that can eclipse the worst inclinations of any lone predator. The following cases are not just stories of murder, they are chilling studies in toxic partnership, where love, obsession, and a shared appetite for destruction forged bonds stronger than any conventional morality. Case 1. The Moors Murders, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. The city of Manchester in the early 1960s was a place of post-war industry and working-class resilience. In this unassuming environment, two people who seemed utterly ordinary began a relationship that would become synonymous with pure, calculated evil. She was Myra Hindley, a typist with a bleached blonde bouffant. He was Ian Brady, a stock clerk with a brooding intensity. To their neighbors and co-workers, they were an unremarkable couple. But behind this facade, they were meticulously planning atrocities that would horrify a nation. Ian Brady was a product of profound alienation. Born in 1938 to a single mother in Glasgow, he was given up for an unofficial adoption and never knew stability. He grew up isolated, a loner who found solace and inspiration in the works of the Marquis de Sade and the grim history of Nazi Germany. He cultivated a philosophy of nihilistic superiority, viewing compassion and conventional morality as weaknesses to be despised. By the time he met the 18-year-old Hindley at their workplace in 1961, he was a vessel waiting to be filled with his darkest fantasies and to find a willing acolyte to share them with. Myra Hindley, from a working-class Catholic background, became instantly and obsessively infatuated with Brady. He was initially indifferent, but her persistence wore him down. To win his affection, she underwent a complete transformation. She abandoned her faith, immersed herself in his library of Nazi literature and true crime, and adopted his cynical worldview. Brady tested her devotion in increasingly disturbing ways, from photographing her posing on the desolate Saddleworth moors to sharing his fantasies of committing the perfect crime. Hindley, desperate to prove herself, not only listened but encouraged him. Their descent into murder was a deliberate, unhurried process. On July 12, 1963, they claimed their first victim. 16-year-old Pauline Reed was lured by Hindley, a trusted neighbor, who asked for help finding a lost glove on the moors. Once there, Brady was waiting. He raped and murdered Pauline, slashing her throat so deeply he nearly decapitated her. They buried her in a shallow grave and returned to their lives as if nothing had happened. The pattern was set. Hindley's trustworthy female face would be the bait, Brady's sadism would be the executioner, and the vast lonely moors would be their secret graveyard. Over the next 2 years, they repeated this horror. 12-year-old John Kilbride was abducted from a market, sexually assaulted and strangled. Hindley was later photographed standing proudly over his burial site, a grotesque trophy shot. 12-year-old Keith Bennett was taken while walking to his grandmother's house. His body has never been found, a source of unending agony for his family. The depths of their depravity were fully revealed with the murder of 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey on Boxing Day 1964. They lured her from a fairground, took her to their home, forced her to pose for nude photographs, and made an audio recording of her final, desperate moments. For 16 minutes, the tape captured Leslie's pleas, her cries for her mother, and the cold, commanding voices of her tormentors telling her to be quiet. It was a snapshot of pure terror, preserved for their gratification. Their spree ended not out of remorse, but from overconfidence. In October 1965, Brady decided to involve Hindley's brother-in-law, David Smith, in the murder of 17-year-old Edward Evans. Smith, horrified by the axe murder he witnessed, pretended to comply before alerting the police. The subsequent raid on their home uncovered Evans's body and, more crucially, led police to the moors. The photographs Hindley had taken became a map to the graves of John Kilbride and Leslie Ann Downey. At the house, police found the incriminating tape in Brady's library of dark literature. Their 1966 trial was a national spectacle. The playing of the tape of Leslie Ann Downey U.S. torture was so harrowing that hardened police officers wept and jurors looked away in shock. Hindley's defense that she was a dominated victim was demolished by the evidence of her active, enthusiastic participation. Both were found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. The judge condemned them as two sadistic killers of the utmost depravity. Hindley spent decades campaigning for release, claiming reformation and brainwashing, but the British public never forgave her. Her police mugshot, with its cold, defiant stare and bleached hair, became an enduring image of evil. Brady, later declared insane, never sought freedom and died in 2017. The case continues to haunt Britain, not only for the brutality of the crimes but for the calculated way two people collaborated to extinguish young lives, each reinforcing the other's capacity for cruelty. The Moors keep their final secret, the resting place of Keith Bennett, a lasting testament to their unrepentant evil. Case 2. The House of Horrors, Fred and Rose West. If Brady and Hindley's evil was exported to the bleak moors, the evil of Fred and Rose West was embedded in the very foundations of a seemingly ordinary house. At 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester, England, the concept of home was perverted into something unspeakable. For 2 decades, Fred and Rose West turned their 3-story terrace house into a private torture chamber and a graveyard for young women. Fred West's upbringing was mired in rural poverty and rumors of incest. He was barely literate and developed a pattern of petty crime and sexual deviance from a young age. He was a controlling, violent man who saw women as objects for his gratification. Rose West, née Letts, came from her own troubled background, with a violent father and a mother who underwent electroconvulsive therapy while pregnant with her. When the 15-year-old Rose met the 27-year-old married Fred in 1968, it was the confluence of 2 toxic streams. Their partnership was a factory of horror. Before they even moved to Cromwell Street, they had already begun killing. Fred's first wife, Rena Costello, and a pregnant nanny, Anne McFall, disappeared and were later found buried in fields, their fingers and toes removed. Most chillingly, while Fred was briefly in prison for theft, Rose murdered his 8-year-old stepdaughter, Charmaine. When Fred was released, they buried the child under their kitchen floor. At 25 Cromwell Street, their depravity escalated. Rose worked as a prostitute with Fred's encouragement, and together they began to prey on vulnerable young women, lodgers, hitchhikers, and runaways. The cellar was soundproofed and converted into a dungeon where victims were bound, tortured, and subjected to prolonged sexual assaults by both Fred and Rose. Once their usefulness was over, they were murdered, often dismembered with Fred's tools, and buried under the patio, in the garden, or beneath the cellar floor. The couple's own children lived in this house of horrors, abused relentlessly and terrorized by Fred's joke that they would end up under the patio like Heather. Heather West, their own daughter, had disappeared in 1987 at age 16 after threatening to leave home. They murdered and buried her in the garden. The unraveling began in 1992 with allegations of sexual abuse from one of their children. The persistent rumors about Heather E.'s disappearance led police to return with a search warrant in 1994. The garden yielded its ghastly secrets. First Heather, then the remains of 8 other young women. The investigation exposed a catastrophic failure of the system. Social workers, teachers, and neighbors had seen signs of abuse but had never pieced together the monstrous truth. Fred confessed to 11 murders before hanging himself in his prison cell on New Year's Day, 1995. His suicide note included a drawing of a gravestone for himself and Rose. Rose stood trial alone, maintaining a facade of ignorance. But the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses, forensic evidence, and the testimony of her own abused children painted a picture of a willing and equally sadistic participant. She was convicted of 10 murders and given a whole life tariff, meaning she will die in prison. The West case is uniquely horrifying because of its setting. The atrocities occurred not in a remote location, but in a family home on a residential street. Children played and slept mere feet from where bodies were dismembered. It was a perversion of domesticity, a stark reminder that the most profound evil can fester behind a perfectly ordinary front door. Case 3. The Ken and Barbie Killers, Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka. In Canada, the case of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka presented a different but equally disturbing dynamic. They were the picture-perfect couple, attractive, young, and affluent. Their lavish 1991 wedding looked like a scene from a fairy tale. But behind the Ken and Barbie facade was a partnership of sexual sadism that would shock the nation. Paul Bernardo was already a predator when they met. He was the Scarborough rapist, a serial attacker who had terrorized women in the Toronto area for years. Karla Homolka, from a stable, middle-class family, was drawn to his dark side. Rather than being repulsed, she became an eager participant, offering him the ultimate gift, her 15-year-old sister, Tammy. On Christmas Eve 1990, they drugged Tammy with animal tranquilizers stolen from Homolka's veterinary clinic and videotaped Bernardo sexually assaulting the unconscious girl. Tammy choked on her own vomit and died, a tragedy that was ruled a tragic accident, allowing the killers to remain free. Emboldened, they escalated to murder. In June 1991, on the very day of their wedding, they abducted 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey. They held her captive for 24 hours, subjecting her to horrific sexual torture, all meticulously recorded. When her blindfold slipped and she saw their faces, they strangled her, dismembered her body, and encased the parts in concrete blocks. While on their honeymoon in Hawaii, police discovered the remains. Their final victim was 15-year-old Kristen French, abducted in broad daylight in April 1992. She was held for 3 days, during which she was forced to watch the tape of Leslie Mahaffey's assault. Her defiance in the face of her tormentors likely sealed her fate. She was murdered and her body dumped on a rural road. The case broke when a battered Homolka, having finally left Bernardo, struck a deal with prosecutors. Portraying herself as a terrified victim forced to participate, she agreed to testify against Bernardo in exchange for a plea bargain on a reduced charge of manslaughter and a 12-year sentence. It was a deal prosecutors felt they needed to secure a murder conviction against Bernardo. However, after the deal was signed, the trophies were discovered, hours of videotapes that showed Homolka not as a coerced victim, but as an enthusiastic, smiling participant. She actively restrained victims, offered suggestions, and reveled in the abuse. The public was outraged at the deal with the devil, but it was too late to rescind. Bernardo was convicted of murder and declared a dangerous offender. Homolka served her 12-year sentence, was released, changed her name, remarried, and started a new life. The case remains one of Canada's most controversial legal failures, a stark lesson in how an articulate, attractive defendant can manipulate the justice system, and a chilling demonstration that evil can wear the most wholesome of masks. Case 4. The Sex Slave Murders, Gerald and Charlene Gallego. The case of Gerald and Charlene Gallego demonstrates how privilege and intelligence are no barriers to profound evil. Charlene Williams had everything: a high IQ, a wealthy family, a stable fiancé, and a future full of promise. Then she met Gerald Gallego, a career criminal with a violent history and a fantasy of owning teenage sex slaves. She chose to walk away from her life and become the friendly face that lured at least 10 young women and girls to their deaths. Gerald's path was set from childhood. His father was executed in the gas chamber, and Gerald himself had a long rap sheet for armed robbery and sexual assault. He was described by a prison psychiatrist as a pansexual with no moral boundaries. When he met the 22-year-old Charlene in 1977, he found a willing partner. He shared his fantasy, and she agreed to help him fulfill it. Their method was chillingly effective. Between 1978 and 1980, they traveled across California and Nevada, with Charlene approaching teenage girls in shopping malls and at fairs. She used her non-threatening, well-dressed appearance to offer them marijuana or easy money. Once they were in the van, Gerald would appear with a gun. The victims were taken to remote locations, raped repeatedly by Gerald while Charlene watched, and then bludgeoned or shot to death. Their spree ended when they made the mistake of abducting a couple from a fraternity party. A witness wrote down their license plate number, leading police to Charlene. They were arrested while trying to flee. Facing the death penalty, Charlene struck a deal. She testified against Gerald. portraying herself as a battered woman acting under duress. In exchange, she pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder and was sentenced to just over 16 years. Gerald was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death in 2 states. He died of cancer in prison in 2002 before his execution could be carried out. Charlene was released in 1997 and has since lived a quiet life under her maiden name. The case forces uncomfortable questions about class and justice. Would a less privileged, less articulate woman have received such a lenient deal? Charlene Gallego proved that evil is not born solely from poverty or desperation. It can be a conscious choice made by those who have every advantage, a choice to aid a monster for the sake of a twisted partnership. Case 5. The 53-day reign of terror, Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown. In the summer of 1984, the American Midwest was gripped by a fear that moved with terrifying speed. For 53 days, Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown cut a swath of violence across 6 states, leaving a trail of 8 confirmed dead, including children. What made this case particularly disturbing was the rapid transformation of Deborah Brown. Coleman was a known sex offender, with a history of charges that were often dismissed due to witness intimidation or lack of evidence. Deborah Brown had no criminal record and was engaged to another man when she met Coleman. She was described as having borderline intellectual functioning and was highly susceptible to influence. Within months of their meeting, she had broken off her engagement and become his enthusiastic accomplice. Their spree was random and brutal. Their victims ranged from a 7-year-old girl to a 77-year-old man. They abducted, raped, beat, and strangled their targets, often using electrical cords. They moved from state to state, stealing cars and leaving communities in panic. The FBI placed Coleman on its 10 most wanted list, but they remained elusive. Brown's participation was undeniable. She helped restrain victims and participated in beatings. The most damning evidence of her state of mind came during her trial, when she passed a note to the judge that read, "I killed the motherfucker and I don't give a damn, I had fun out of it." This was not the statement of a coerced victim, but of someone who had embraced the violence. Coleman was sentenced to death in 3 states and was executed in 2002. Brown also received death sentences, but they were later commuted to life in prison due to her intellectual disabilities. Her case sits at the complex intersection of criminal responsibility and mental capacity. Was she a manipulated pawn or a willing participant who found liberation in cruelty? The 53-day rampage stands as a terrifying example of how quickly evil can escalate when 2 people find in each other a catalyst for their worst impulses. Case 6. The grandparents of death, Ray and Faye Copeland. The image of the serial killer is rarely that of an elderly, hard-of-hearing grandfather and his quilt-making grandmother. Yet Ray and Faye Copeland, in their 70s, became the oldest couple ever convicted of serial murder in the United States. Their crimes were not driven by passion or sadism, but by cold, calculated greed. Ray was a lifelong criminal, illiterate and violent, with a long history of cattle rustling and fraud. Faye, raised in a strict religious household that demanded wifely submission, endured decades of his abuse. Their scheme was simple. They hired transient farmhands, men with no families, men who wouldn't be missed. These men would purchase cattle at auctions with bad checks provided by Ray. Once the cattle were sold for cash and the checks bounced, the farmhand became a liability. Ray would take them to a remote part of their Missouri farm, shoot them in the back of the head with a .22 rifle, and bury them in a shallow grave. The most chilling evidence against them was found in their home. Faye kept a neat handwritten ledger of the men who had worked for them. Next to the names of at least 12 men, she had drawn a precise X. Police also discovered a quilt Faye had made, stitched together from the clothing of the murdered men. It was a grotesque artifact of domesticity intertwined with murder. Ray was sentenced to death but died in prison of natural causes. Faye was also sentenced to death, though it was later commuted to life. The case forces us to confront the fact that evil has no age limit. It also presents a complex portrait of complicity. Was Faye a battered wife acting under duress, or was her meticulous record-keeping and quilt-making a sign of a willing, if silent, partner in murder? Case 7. The Morehouse Murders, David and Catherine Burney. In the suburbs of Perth, Australia, the unassuming house at 3 Moorhouse Street became a prison and a killing ground. David Burney, a known criminal with violent sexual fantasies, reconnected with his childhood neighbor, Catherine Burney, in their mid-30s. She abandoned her husband and 7 children to be with him, and together they embarked on a 5-week spree of abduction, rape, and murder in 1986. Their method was chillingly direct. David would lure women to the house under false pretenses, offering cheap car tires a ride home, where they would be immediately chained to a bed. The couple would then subject them to repeated sexual assaults before driving them to remote locations to be murdered. David strangled most of the victims with nylon cord. In one instance, he ordered Catherine to prove her devotion by strangling a 15-year-old girl, Susanna Candy, which she did without hesitation. Their spree was ended by the courage of their final intended victim, 17-year-old Kate Moyer. After being held captive and assaulted, Moyer memorized details of the house and her captors. When Catherine briefly turned her back, Moyer escaped through a window and led police directly to the house. Her detailed testimony and the physical evidence found inside secured their convictions. David Burney pleaded guilty and was given a life sentence. He died by suicide in prison in 2005. Catherine Burney was found guilty and sentenced to life with a never-to-be-released designation, making her one of only a few women in Australian history to receive such a sentence. The case is a stark example of how a shared darkness can be rapidly activated, turning a rekindled childhood connection into a deadly partnership in a shockingly short amount of time. Case 8. The Child Bride and the Criminal, Judith and Alvin Neely. The case of Judith Neely forces a painful and uncomfortable question about the nature of culpability. At 18, she became the youngest woman ever sentenced to death in America for her role in a brutal crime spree with her husband, Alvin. But their story began when she was just 15, and he was a 22-year-old career criminal. Alvin Neely groomed Judith, isolating her and drawing her into his criminal world. In September 1982, they abducted 13-year-old Lisa Ann Milliken from a Georgia mall. Over 3 days, they held her captive in a motel, sexually assaulting her and injecting her with liquid drain cleaner in a torturous attempt to kill her. When she survived, Judith led the girl to a cliff in Alabama and shot her 6 times before pushing her body into the canyon. At trial, Judith's defense argued she was a victim herself, a child bride manipulated by a dominant, abusive older man. The prosecution, however, presented evidence of her active and enthusiastic participation. She was the one who injected the drain cleaner, who pulled the trigger, who showed no remorse. The jury convicted her and sentenced her to death, while Alvin received life in prison. After 16 years on death row, Judith's sentence was commuted to life by the governor. The case remains a deeply divisive touchstone in discussions about coercion, age of responsibility, and the blurred line between victim and perpetrator. Can someone be both? Judith Neely's life sentence represents the legal system's final, unsatisfying answer to an impossibly complex human tragedy. Case 9. The Confession Kings, Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole. In the annals of American crime, no case is more mired in confusion and doubt than that of Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole. They were compulsive liars who confessed to hundreds of murders across the United States, sending investigators on a wild goose chase that ultimately obscured the truth of their actual crimes. Both men emerged from childhoods of almost unimaginable abuse and neglect. Lucas suffered brain damage from his prostitute mother's beatings and was forced to wear girls' clothing. Toole was raised by a Satanist grandmother and was abused from a young age. When they met in 1976, they formed a bond of shared damage and began a life of drifting and crime. They claim to have murdered hundreds of people together, with Lucas eventually putting his number at over 600. Eager to clear cold cases, law enforcement from dozens of jurisdictions flocked to interview them. Lucas, in particular, was given preferential treatment, better food, cigarettes, trips in exchange for confessions. He proved to have an uncanny knowledge of unsolved murders, but it was later revealed he had been fed details from case files and newspaper clippings. A task force eventually determined that the vast majority of their confessions were false. Lucas was convicted of 3 murders he almost certainly committed. his mother, and 2 other victims. Toole was convicted of 6 murders, including arson deaths. He also confessed to the murder of 6-year-old Adam Walsh, a case that was officially closed with him as the perpetrator, though doubts remain. Lucas had his death sentence commuted and died in prison in 2001. Toole died in 1996. Their legacy is one of profound frustration. They were genuine killers, but their compulsive lying and the desperation of police created a hall of mirrors where the true extent of their evil became impossible to discern, leaving countless families without real answers. Case 10. The Angel of Death and Her Acolyte, Gwendolyn Graham and Catherine Wood. The final case strikes at the heart of our trust in caregivers. Gwendolyn Graham and Catherine Wood were nurses' aides at the Alpine Manor nursing home in Michigan. They were entrusted with the lives of elderly, vulnerable residents. Instead, they turned their ward into a hunting ground. Their relationship was intense and toxic. Graham, the dominant partner, proposed they kill patients as a way to bond. In a macabre twist, they initially planned to select victims whose first initials would spell out the word murder. Over 4 months in 1987, they suffocated 5 elderly women with washcloths. After each murder, they took souvenirs, small personal items from their victims, as trophies. When their relationship soured and Graham moved away, Wood, burdened by guilt, began to confess to friends. Her testimony led to an investigation. To secure a conviction against Graham, prosecutors offered Wood a plea deal. She testified against her former lover in exchange for a 40-year sentence. Graham was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder and received life without parole. Wood was released on parole in 2020, a decision that sparked outrage among the victims' families. The case is a horrifying example of the betrayal of a sacred trust. It reveals how a toxic relationship dynamic can pervert the instincts of care into an impulse to kill, and how the quest for a twisted, intimate connection can lead to the destruction of the most helpless among us. These 10 cases, spanning decades and continents, all share a common, terrifying thread: the exponential power of shared evil. From the windswept moors of England to the quiet suburbs of Perth, from the nursing homes of Michigan to the heartland of America, these partnerships demonstrate that the most profound dangers often come not from a lone wolf, but from a pair, each one reflecting and amplifying the other's darkness. They force us to ask difficult questions about the nature of coercion and complicity, as with Judith Neely and Catherine Wood, about the failure of justice systems, as with the controversial plea deals for Karla Homolka and Charlene Gallego, and about the very nature of evil itself, whether it is born or made, and how it can fester in the most ordinary of places, hidden behind the faces of grandparents, nurses, and the boy and girl next door. Which case shocked you the most? The calculated cruelty of Brady and Hindley, the domestic horror of the Wests, the manipulation of the justice system by Homolka, or the sheer, random speed of Coleman and Brown's rampage? The legacy of these dark partnerships is a permanent stain on our understanding of human nature, a chilling reminder that when 2 people find in each other permission for their worst impulses, the results can be cataclysmic. Thank you for watching. If you found this exploration of true crime's darkest partnerships compelling, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more deep dives into the cases that continue to haunt us.